I can't believe it, my wife of 25 years said, her voice as cold and hard as the granite island between us. After all this time, after everything, I find out I married a useless man. That was the moment my life split into two distinct parts before I was useless. And after the verdict was delivered in the heart of the Austin home I had built for us, not with a scream, but with the chilling finality of a judge's gavel. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. To understand how a quarter century of marriage could be executed by a single sentence, you have to know what happened just an hour earlier, on the afternoon of June 1st, 2025. I was in a frigidly air-conditioned law office on Congress Avenue, staring at the last page of the dissolution papers for my company, Innovate Solutions. For a decade it had been my life, my passion. I'd poured my soul into it, and more concretely, $5 million of my own money. Now, all that remained was a signature line on a thick stack of paper. The lawyer, a man whose polished demeanor screamed billable hours, pushed the pen towards me. The stroke of the nib on the paper was a quiet, anticlimactic scratch, a sound far too small to signify the death of a dream. With that, my professional life as I knew it was over. The drive home was a surreal journey through a city that suddenly felt alien. The Texas sun beat down on the pavement, but inside the car, a cold dread had settled deep in my bones. I drove the BMW, a car I'd bought to celebrate a major contract a few years back, and it felt like a costume from a life I no longer lived. At 52 years old, I was unemployed. My reputation in the Austin tech scene was in tatters, and my life savings were gone. I remember seeing the familiar skyline, the towers filled with successful people, and feeling like a complete ghost. All I could think about was how I was going to explain this to Linda. How I would tell the woman who had stood by me through every previous risk that this time the gamble hadn't paid off. Our home, a sprawling masterpiece of glass and stone overlooking the deep blue of Lake Travis, had always been my sanctuary. It was the physical proof of everything we had built together. Every stone in that facade, every custom window was paid for by the company I had just signed away. This house was meant to be our fortress, our legacy, the place we would watch our grandchildren play. But as I pulled into the long, curving driveway, it felt different. It felt like her territory now, a kingdom whose king had just been deposed. The house was unnervingly silent when I walked in. No music, no television, just the low hum of the air conditioning. I found her in the kitchen exactly as I had pictured. She was leaning against the granite island, a glass of chilled white wine in her hand, dressed impeccably in white linen. She looked like she was waiting for a caterer, not for her husband to return from the funeral of his career. Her eyes met mine, and there was no warmth in them, no question of how did it go, just a flat, unnerving assessment. She already knew. I tried to find the words, my voice sounding weak to my own ears. Linda, it's done. It's over. I took a breath, forcing myself to push forward. It's a setback, Linda, I said, my voice pleading slightly. A bad one, I know, but we have options. We can sell the boat, downsize from this house. I have other ideas. I just need a little time to. She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor that echoed slightly in the cavernous kitchen. Ideas? She said, her voice dripping with a scorn I'd never heard before. Are they anything like your idea to pour another million into Innovate back in January? I told you that was a mistake, Mark. I told you to take the buyout offer last year, but the tech genius knew better. I was stunned into silence for a moment. You agreed with that decision, I finally managed to say. You said you believed in the expansion. I supported my husband. She snapped, her voice rising for the first time, sharp and brittle. What was I supposed to do? But this is different. This is failure. Do you have any idea what this means for us? For me, the Hendersons just booked a month in Tuscany. Carol's husband just closed that massive commercial real estate deal. And I'm supposed to tell them what? That we're selling the house because my husband, the man everyone looked up to, lost everything? That he's a failure? She took a step closer, her eyes as cold and gray as a winter storm on the lake. And that sips when she said it. The words that became the official timestamp of the end of my marriage. I can believe it. After all this time, after everything I put into this, I find out I married a useless man. The sound seemed to vacuum all the air out of the room. It wasn't an insult born of anger. It was a clinical diagnosis, a final stock valuation. In that moment, I saw the truth of our entire marriage laid bare. It had been a long-term business arrangement, and my stock had just plummeted to zero. There was nothing to say. Arguing would be like trying to reason with the executioner, so I did the only thing I could. I turned my back on her, on the life we had built, and on the woman who had just declared me worthless. I walked down the long hallway, the photos on the wall of a smiling, happy couple seeming to mock me with every step. I opened the door to the guest room at the far end of the house, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The latch clicked into place with a soft final sound, like a gavel striking wood, ending a trial I never even knew I was in. I was no longer a husband. I was just a useless man, relegated to the guest room. The first few days in the guest room were a disorienting fog of shame and disbelief. The room itself was pleasant enough, tastefully decorated by Linda, of course, with a serene view of the oak trees in the side yard, but it felt like a luxury prison cell. I spent hours just sitting on the edge of the bed, the silence of the house broken only by the muffled sounds of Linda's life continuing without me. Just on the other side of the door, her cheerful phone calls, the light laughter as she talked to friends, the chime of a text message. Each sound was a small, sharp reminder that while my world had stopped, hers had simply shifted gears. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was a ghost haunting the east wing of my own home, a problem she was already compartmentalizing. The end of the first week brought a new, more concrete level of humiliation. It was a Saturday morning, and Linda was out for what she'd loudly described on the phone as a desperately needed brunch and retail therapy session. I needed to get a suit from the master closet for a potential meeting. I walked down the familiar hallway, the plush runner muffling my steps, and put my key in the lock of our bedroom. It didn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it, my confusion quickly turning to a cold knot of dread in my stomach. It wasn't jammed, it had been changed. She had changed the locks. Without a word, without any discussion, she had physically barred me from the room we had shared for over a decade. I stood there, key in hand, staring at the polished brass of the doorknob, and understood that I was officially in exile. Her spending, which I'd always considered extravagant but manageable, took on a manic, almost celebratory quality. I started getting email alerts from our joint bank account, the one that held the last $1.2 million of our liquid assets. First, a charge for over $1,000 at a high-end spa in downtown Austin. Then 2 days later, a $3,000 charge from a boutique hotel for a weekend getaway. She never mentioned. I'd lie awake in the guest room bed, my phone glowing in the dark, watching our retirement fund. My retirement fund, hemorrhage money. It was like watching a stranger vandalize my own home, and I felt powerless to stop it. She was spending our future as if it were an inconvenience she needed to get rid of. The real proof, the piece of evidence that shattered any lingering sentiment I had, came late one night during the second week. Linda was out with friends, a common occurrence now. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing, so I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the under-cabinet lighting. And there, on the gleaming granite counter, next to a pile of mail she hadn't bothered to sort, was a crumpled piece of paper, a receipt from Neiman Marcus. My hand trembled slightly as I picked it up and smoothed it out. The paper was thick, expensive. The logo was elegant. My eyes scanned the details, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The item description was for a Celine Triumph tote. I had no idea what that was, but the price told me everything I needed to know. The subtotal was $4,500. With tax, it was closer to $5,000 for a handbag. Then my eyes found the date at the top of the slip, June 3rd, 2025. I did the math 3 times, as if a different result were possible. June 3rd, I had come home and told her my company was gone, that our life was about to change forever on June 1st. This receipt was dated just 48 hours later. This wasn't an act of a grieving partner seeking comfort. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a statement. This was a celebration of her independence from me, the useless man. She was paying for her new life with the last of our old one. In that moment, standing in the dark of my own kitchen, a profound and chilling clarity washed over me. The woman I had loved and built a life with for 25 years didn't exist. She had been a ghost all along. I had been married to a business partner, and our contract had been terminated due to my poor performance. The despair I'd been drowning in for 2 weeks didn't disappear, but it changed. It crystallized into something colder, harder. It was the quiet realization that you are utterly, completely alone. I carefully folded the receipt, the paper a tangible piece of her betrayal, and slid it into my pocket. I walked back to the guest room, but I wasn't a ghost anymore. A ghost is lost. I knew exactly where I was. I was at war, and I had just collected my first piece of evidence. For another week I wallowed in that cold, hard resolve. I'd spend the long, suffocating Austen days in the guest room, the crumpled Neiman Marcus receipt lying in the nightstand drawer like a sacred relic of my wife's betrayal. The anger was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my despair. I knew I had to do something, but the sheer scale of my defeat was paralyzing. Linda continued her life as if I were already a distant memory, coming and going with a breezy indifference that was more painful than any argument could ever be. I was a ghost, and I was running out of time. The joint account was draining, and with it my options. The spark came as ideas often do in the dead of night. It was around 2 a.m., the house was silent, and sleep was a country I couldn't find on a map. I was staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the last 25 years on a torturous loop, when a flicker of something else pushed through the noise. It was an old idea, a business plan for a hyper-efficient logistics optimization platform that I'd shelved years ago. As I stared at the ceiling, the idea felt different this time. It wasn't just a concept, it was a solution whose time had come. The market was finally ready. Cloud computing costs had plummeted. AI-driven predictive analysis was no longer a theory, and global supply chains were more tangled and desperate for optimization than ever before. The very market forces that had made Innovate's hardware obsolete were the same ones that could make this new software idea a giant. It was a long shot, a desperate Hail Mary, but it was the first thing in weeks that felt like a beginning instead of an end. My heart started pounding. Before I could second-guess myself, I grabbed my phone and found the number for David Chen. He was the most brilliant developer who'd ever worked for me, a kid I'd mentored right out of college. He was fiercely loyal, and he'd been devastated when Innovate went under. It was 2:13 a.m. I hesitated for only a second before hitting dial. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Mark, is everything okay?" "David," I said, my voice quiet but urgent, "I have an idea, a big one. Are you busy?" There was a pause, the sound of him sitting up in bed. "For you, never, where and when." We met an hour later at a 24-hour diner off I-35, a place that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Under the harsh hum of the fluorescent lights, I took a paper napkin and a pen, and I sketched out the entire architecture. I talked for an hour straight, the concepts and code and market strategy pouring out of me in a torrent. The passion I thought had died with my company was roaring back to life. When I finally finished, leaning back in the sticky vinyl booth, David leaned in, his eyes sharp. "The concept is brilliant, Mark. But what about latency for real-time fleet tracking across continents? And how do we handle the data integration with legacy shipping manifests? Some of these companies are still using systems from the 90s. I felt a surge of adrenaline. These were the right questions. We build on a distributed ledger. It makes the data immutable and cuts latency to near zero. And for the legacy systems, we design a simple API wrapper that can translate their archaic data into our format in the cloud. We don't change their system, we just teach ours to speak its language. It's an elegant, low-cost solution for them." David's eyes lit up. He stared at the ink-covered napkin. That's genius." He looked up at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw someone look at me without pity or contempt. He saw the man I used to be. "Mark," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "This isn't just an idea. This is a unicorn. I'm in. All the way." That was the moment I knew I wasn't just building a company. I was building a weapon. The next morning, I felt a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I sat in the guest room, opened my laptop, and navigated to a bookmarked page I hadn't visited in a decade. The login for my Vanguard brokerage account. It was a premarital account, a nest egg I'd started with a small inheritance in my 20s and had never touched. I'd never even told Linda it existed. It was my one and only secret. My ace in the hole. The balance was just over $250,000. It was the last of my own money on earth. With steady hands, I created a new shell corporation with the state of Delaware Phoenix Digital Holdings, LLC. Then I initiated a wire transfer for the full amount. Watching the confirmation screen flash, I felt a terrifying, thrilling sense of vertigo. I had just pushed all my chips to the center of the table. There was one final step. I needed a shield. I needed a shark. I looked up the number for Jessica Riley, a divorce attorney whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence in Austin's wealthier circles. She was known for being brilliant, ruthless, and incredibly expensive. I dialed her office. Her assistant put me through immediately. I explained the situation in as few words as possible. Her voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the gears turning. "What is it you want from me, Mr. Crawford?" she asked. "Time," I said simply. "Linda will be making a move soon. I expect she'll file for divorce and try to seize everything. I need you to stall her. Use any legal means necessary. I just need a little time." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That can be arranged," she said. "But to what end?" I took a deep breath. "And Jessica, when the time comes for a final meeting, I don't want it to be emotional. I want it on my terms, somewhere professional, where facts are the only things that matter." I could almost hear her smile through the phone. "Mr. Crawford," she said, a new energy in her voice, "I believe you and I are going to get along just fine." I hung up the phone and looked out the guest room window. The war had two fronts now. One fought in secret with lines of code and business plans. The other fought in the open with legal filings and delays. For the first time since that horrible day in the kitchen, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was controlled. While Linda was busy liquidating our past, I was busy building my future. I thought of it as building an ark. She was living it up, oblivious to the storm of her own making that was coming, while David and I were working in secret, preparing for the flood. Our ark wasn't made of gopher wood. It was built with lines of code and fueled by cheap coffee. We leased a small anonymous office in a sprawling tech park in North Austin, a place so generic it was the perfect cover. There was no name on the door, just a number. Inside there were no windows, just two desks, a whiteboard, and the constant reassuring hum of servers. It was the complete opposite of my old corner office at Innovate Solutions, and I had never been more productive in my life. The month of June bled into July, and the Texas summer heat settled over Austin like a thick, wet blanket. Our days became a blur of relentless work. We were a two-man team building a platform that would normally require a staff of 20. Our first week was nothing but database architecture. We designed it from the ground up to handle petabytes of data without a millisecond of lag, knowing that scale would be everything. The next 2 weeks were a blur of pure coding. I took the back end, crafting the complex predictive algorithms that were the secret sauce of the whole platform. The part that would tell a company not where its shipments are, but where they will be in 3 days, accounting for weather, traffic, and 1,000 other variables. David, with a speed and elegance I'd never seen, built the entire front end, a user interface so clean and intuitive that a shipping dispatcher with no tech background could master it in under an hour. My phone would buzz occasionally with a banking alert, a notification of Linda's latest expenditure, a $1,200 charge at a designer boutique on South Congress, an $800 bill from a trendy new restaurant where she'd taken her friends. I'd glance at the notification, then turn back to the monitor where I was refining an algorithm. The contrast was stark. She was burning the past while I was architecting the future. The inevitable finally happened on July 10th. It was a sweltering Wednesday afternoon. I was deep in code when my burner phone rang. It was Jessica Riley. "Mark," she said, her voice sharp. "A process server just called my office. He couldn't find you, so he's on his way to your residence. Consider yourself served." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my voice was calm. "Thank you, Jessica." A minute later, my personal phone rang. It was Linda. Her voice was syrupy sweet, dripping with false concern. "Mark, honey, a man just dropped off some papers for you. They look important. I left them on the front porch table." She didn't want to hand them to me. She wanted me to pick them up like a package, a final little twist of the knife to remind me of my status in that house. I drove home, retrieved the thick manila envelope from the porch without going inside, and drove straight back to the office. My sanctuary. I didn't want to read it in her house. I wanted to read it in mine. Under the sterile fluorescent lights, with David watching silently from his desk, I tore it open. It was a petition for divorce. I scanned the pages, my eyes catching the cold legalistic phrases. Irreconcilable differences. No reasonable expectation of reconciliation. And then I got to the demands. They were, as my outline had predicted, breathtakingly arrogant. She wanted exclusive use of the primary residence, effective immediately. She wanted 75% of all known marital assets, citing my financial mismanagement and the failure of Innovate Solutions. She wanted lifetime spousal support, calculated based on the lavish lifestyle we had enjoyed for the last decade. And then I saw the line, a masterpiece of legal audacity, drafted by her smug attorney. He argued she was entitled to this because of her significant emotional and financial contributions to the marriage. The financial contributions she was currently making consisted of draining our joint account at a rate of $20,000 a week. The document also included a financial disclosure, listing my total liquid worth at just under $1 million, the dwindling remains of our joint account. David watched my face, expecting an explosion. He was expecting me to rage, to curse, to throw the papers across the room. But as I read that final insulting line, a strange thing happened. A genuine wide smile spread across my face. It was the first real smile I'd had in over a month. Because in that moment I saw her entire strategy laid bare. Her whole case was built on the assumption that I was a broken, penniless failure. This document, this declaration of war, was based on a complete and total ignorance of the reality I was building in that windowless room. She hadn't just underestimated me. She had handed me the blueprint to her own destruction. I picked up my burner phone and called Jessica. "I've got them," I said. "It's outrageous, Mark," she said, her voice tight with anger. "We'll fight every last line of it." "No, Jessica," I said, looking at the lines of code on my monitor, the architecture of my $10 million secret. "It's perfect. Don't respond yet. Just file for an extension. Blame it on emotional distress. Anything you want. Just buy me a few more weeks." August arrived in Austin like a furnace blast, and with it, the month the tide finally began to turn. For weeks, David and I had been courting a mid-sized shipping company out of Dallas. They were the perfect first client, large enough to be a major validation, but still agile enough to adopt our new logistics platform quickly. Securing their business wasn't just a goal, it was the entire plan. Without them, Phoenix Digital was just a concept. With them, it was a company. The final presentation was a 2-hour video conference in our tiny windowless office. I remember my shirt sticking to my back, not from the heat, but from the sheer nerve-shredding pressure. Our entire secret, our entire arc, depended on this one meeting. The call came 2 days later, on August 15th. I remember seeing the Dallas area code flash on my burner phone and my breath catching in my throat. It was their CEO. His voice was calm, professional. "Mark," he said, "we've reviewed the proposal. It's impressive. We're in. Our legal team is sending over the 2-year contract now." I thanked him, my voice betraying none of the seismic relief that was rocking my entire body. I hung up the phone and looked at David. He was frozen, his eyes wide. I just nodded. The room erupted. We weren't yelling or screaming, but it was a celebration of pure, unadulterated triumph. The contract that arrived an hour later was for 7 figures. It wasn't real, however, until the money was in the bank. The contract stipulated an initial payment of $500,000 upon signing. We spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation, constantly refreshing the Phoenix Digital bank account page. Then, on a Friday afternoon, it happened. The balance, which had been steadily dwindling from my initial seed money, suddenly jumped. There it was, in crisp, beautiful black and white digital numbers, $500,000. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. It was the first domino. It was proof. That night, David and I celebrated in the office with a $20 bottle of champagne drank from coffee mugs. We were officially in business. My newfound confidence must have been radiating off me, because the next time I saw Linda, her contempt had an extra edge of annoyance. I had to go to the house to pick up some forwarded mail. I took it back to the guest room and opened my laptop to update our financial models with the new contract revenue. She appeared in the doorway holding a shopping bag from yet another boutique. She looked at my screen, filled with its complex columns of numbers and projections, and scoffed. "Still hiding in here playing with your little spreadsheets, Mark," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't you ever get bored of pretending to work?" I just looked up at her and gave her a small, quiet smile. "It passes the time," I said. She rolled her eyes and walked away, completely oblivious that the little spreadsheets she was mocking were the blueprints of a $10 million company. The dramatic irony was so thick I could have choked on it. That was the last push I needed. My plan had been defensive, a way to survive. Now it was time to go on the offensive. The next morning, I called Jessica Riley. The tone of this call was entirely different from our first. I was no longer a desperate man asking for time. I was a CEO with $500,000 of new revenue in the bank, giving instructions. "Jessica," I said, "it's time. I want you to reach out to Linda's lawyer. Tell them we're ready to meet for a final mediation." "Are you sure, Mark?" she asked, a note of caution in her voice. "We haven't received their updated financial disclosures yet." "I have all the financial disclosures I need," I told her, "but we are not meeting on their terms. You will tell them the meeting will take place on one day and one day only, September 10th, and it will be at a neutral location, a boardroom at a third-party law firm downtown. Non-negotiable." Just as I predicted, Linda's lawyer agreed almost immediately. Their arrogance was a tangible thing. They saw my demand for a specific date not as a sign of strength, but of desperation. A man finally ready to cave and get it over with. They had no idea they were agreeing to attend their own execution. After I hung up with Jessica, I made one final call. It was to one of the most respected business valuation firms in Texas. I explained that I was the sole owner of a new tech startup with a signed long-term contract, and that I needed a certified, rush-ordered valuation of the company's total worth. "I need the final notarized report in my hands by the first week of September," I told the senior partner. No later, he assured me it could be done. The pieces were now all in motion. The trap was set. All I had to do was keep building, and wait for September 10th. The last 3 weeks of August crawled by with agonizing slowness. Life settled into a strange, bifurcated rhythm. By day, I was the co-founder and CEO of a rapidly growing tech startup, working with David to refine our platform and prepare for our next phase of growth. We were a well-oiled machine, fueled by a shared mission. But at night, I would return to the house on Lake Travis to play the part of the ghost, the defeated man living in the guest room. The duality was jarring, but necessary. My performance at home was just as critical to the plan's success as my performance at the office. Linda's arrogance, now that a final meeting was on the calendar, inflated to an astonishing degree. She treated my presence with a kind of dismissive, pitying contempt that was somehow worse than her earlier coldness. To her, my agreeing to mediate was the final, pathetic wave of a white flag. She believed I was a broken man, counting down the days until she put me out of my misery and took everything I had left. She had no idea that I was also counting down the days, but for a very different reason. Her confidence made her careless, and I was counting on that. The final piece of evidence I needed from her fell into my lap on a warm evening at the end of the month. I had come back to the house to pick up a specific book on data architecture I'd left in the study. My old phone, my personal one, had been sitting on the guest room nightstand for weeks, and I'd taken to leaving it plugged in, ostensibly just to keep the battery from dying. But I had also enabled the simple voice-activated recording app. It was a long shot, but the guest room window looked out onto the stone patio and garden where Linda often took her evening calls. That night, as I was searching for the book, I heard her voice drift in from outside. She was talking to her friend Carol, her tone a giddy mix of gossip and triumph. I stood perfectly still in the hallway, listening. Honestly, Linda said, her voice carrying clearly through the screen door, it's pathetic. He's completely broken, Carol. He just sits in the guest room all day staring at spreadsheets. It's like he's trying to pretend he still has a job. She let out a short, cruel laugh. But it's almost over. My lawyer says he has nothing left to fight with. I'll be free of this useless man in a few weeks, and I'll get everything. The house, the accounts, everything. I didn't move. I just let the words wash over me, each one a nail in her own coffin. I waited until I heard her go back inside before I walked calmly back to the guest room. The little red light on the phone screen indicated it had been recording. I saved the audio file, renaming it evidence_C. Impri 3. It was irrefutable proof of her intent, her character, her all-consuming greed, all captured in her own cheerful, confident voice. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. The final piece of the puzzle arrived at my office during the first week of September. It came not in an email, but via a secured courier. A man in a crisp uniform had me sign for a thick, sealed envelope. My hands were surprisingly steady as I took it back to my desk. This was it, the valuation. David knew what it was and kept his distance, respecting the gravity of the moment. I sliced it open and pulled out a document that was over 50 pages long, bound in a professional blue cover. It was filled with market analysis, revenue projections, and technical assessments. I skipped right to the end, to the final summary page, the one with the notarized seal from the state of Texas. My eyes scanned down the page to the line in bold letters. Final fair market valuation as of September 5th, 2025. And there was the number. A conservative, defensible, and utterly beautiful number. $10 million. $10 million. I didn't shout. I didn't even smile. I just felt a profound, ice-cold calm settle over me. It was real. It was certified. It was a fact, printed in official ink and backed by a mountain of data. This number was the truth, and it was about to obliterate the fiction Linda had built her entire case upon. That evening, before I left the office, I opened my briefcase. I took out the crumpled Neiman Marcus receipt and placed it in a protective sleeve. I slid a small USB drive containing the audio file of Linda's phone call into a side pocket. And finally I placed the 50-page notarized valuation report squarely in the center. I closed the briefcase and spun the combination locks. It felt less like a piece of luggage and more like an arsenal. The calm was over. The storm was scheduled to arrive on September 10th. September 10th arrived, not with a storm, but with the eerie, preternatural calm that often precedes one. I woke up before my alarm, feeling a profound and chilling sense of clarity. There was no nervousness, no fear. There was only the plan. I put on a dark charcoal suit, one I hadn't worn since the final days at Innovate Solutions. Back then, it had felt like the costume of a failed man. Today it felt like armor. I picked up my briefcase from the floor of the guest room. The weight of it was familiar, but its contents were entirely new. It was a $10 million arsenal, disguised as a leather bag. The mediation was scheduled for 10 a.m. in a conference room on the 30th floor of a glass tower downtown. When I arrived, my lawyer, Jessica Riley, was already there, a picture of calm professionalism as she looked out at the panoramic view of the Austin skyline. She gave me a small, confident nod. We didn't need to speak. We had gone over the plan a dozen times. We were ready. Linda and her lawyer, a man named Arthur Fleming, arrived a few minutes late, a deliberate power move. They strode in radiating a smug, victorious energy. Linda looked incredible, dressed in a sharp, expensive suit, every inch the wronged, affluent wife about to get her due. She didn't look at me. She didn't have to. Her lawyer did all the talking, his voice dripping with the false, syrupy sympathy of a predator who enjoys playing with his food. He started with a long, condescending speech about the unfortunate realities of financial downturns and the emotional toll they can take on a marriage. He praised Linda for her grace and fortitude during this difficult time. It was a masterful performance, painting me as a pitiable, incompetent failure and her as a long-suffering saint. I just sat there, my hands folded calmly on the polished mahogany table, and let him talk. Jessica remained perfectly still beside me, her expression neutral. Finally, Fleming reached the grand finale. With a dramatic flourish, he slid a thick, leather-bound document across the table. In the spirit of resolving this amicably and allowing you both to move on, he said, his voice oozing magnanimity, we have prepared a final, non-negotiable offer. I think you'll find it's more than generous, all things considered. The document sat in the middle of the table between us. It was an insult disguised as a settlement. I didn't touch it. I didn't even look at it. I just let it sit there and ignored irrelevant piece of fiction. My deliberate inaction seemed to throw Fleming off for a second. He exchanged a quick, confused glance with Linda. After letting the silence hang in the air for a full 10 seconds, I reached down and opened my own briefcase. I pulled out a single, slim, blue file folder. It looked insignificant next to their ostentatious leather-bound tome. I placed it on the table and gave it a gentle push. It slid across the polished surface and came to a stop right next to their offer. I have a counteroffer, I said, my voice even and calm. Fleming let out a short, incredulous scoff. He looked at Linda and rolled his eyes. A little piece of theater for his client, with an air of bored indulgence. He reached out and opened the folder. Linda leaned over his shoulder, a smirk playing on her lips, ready to see what pathetic scrap I'd managed to pull together. The first document on top was the Certificate of Incorporation for Phoenix Digital Holdings, LLC, complete with the official seal of the state of Delaware. I watched Fleming's eyes scan the page. The smugness on his face was replaced by a flicker of confusion. He looked up at me, then back down at the paper. What is this? He flipped to the next page. It was the cover sheet of our signed 2-year contract with the Dallas Shipping Company. I watched his eyes move, his professional training forcing him to read the details. I saw the moment he registered the client's name. I saw the slight widening of his eyes as he processed the 7-figure contract value printed in clear black ink. The confusion on his face was now curdling into something else. Dawning, horrified comprehension. His hand, which had been so languid, was now frozen on the page. He turned to the final document, the one I had placed at the very back. It was the summary page of the valuation report. His entire body went rigid. His gaze was locked on the bottom of the page. He was a statue. But I wasn't watching him anymore. I was watching Linda. She had been watching her lawyer's face, her own expression shifting from smugness to confusion to alarm. Impatient, she leaned closer, her eyes finding the same line of text that had frozen him. I watched her face, a face I had known for 25 years, and saw an expression I had never seen before. The perfectly applied makeup, the confident set of her jaw, it all seemed to melt away. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The only thing that moved was her eyes darting back and forth across the page, as if she could force the numbers to change through sheer will. And then, in the dead, tomb-like silence of that 30-floor boardroom, came a sound, a sharp, ragged, desperate gasp for air. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The ambush was complete. Linda's ragged gasp for air seemed to hang in the sterile, air-conditioned room for an eternity. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. Her lawyer, Arthur Fleming, was frozen, his hand still resting on the valuation report, as if it had physically burned him. His face, which moments before had been a mask of smug condescension, was now a slack, empty portrait of disbelief. Linda stood beside him, trembling, her knuckles white where she gripped the back of his chair. The entire universe of the 30-floor boardroom had been shattered and rearranged in the space of 30 seconds. It was Fleming who broke first. He snatched his hand back from the folder and shot to his feet, knocking his chair back slightly. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and accusation. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, stammering sound came out. He looked at Linda, then back at the papers, then at his own useless, leather-bound settlement offer. His professional composure, his entire identity as a high-powered attorney, had been utterly demolished. We require a recess," He finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We need a moment. Now." He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed Linda's elbow and they practically fled the room, leaving the door swinging shut behind them. Jessica and I didn't speak. We didn't have to. We just sat there in the quiet of our victory and watched the show through the conference room's floor-to-ceiling glass walls. The hallway became a stage for a silent, frantic pantomime of their defeat. Linda, her composure completely gone, was a whirlwind of rage. Her hands were flying, jabbing a finger at Fleming's chest, then pointing furiously back at the closed door of the conference room. I could see her mouth forming words I was glad I couldn't hear. She was incandescent with a fury that was born of pure panicked greed. Fleming, for his part, looked like a man watching his career flash before his eyes. He kept trying to calm her down, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. He was sweating, his face pale. At one point he leaned against the wall, rubbing his forehead in a gesture of total, abject defeat. I could see the wheels turning in his head. His entire case, his entire strategy, the arrogant demands, the condescending speeches, all of it was built on one simple foundational fact, that Mark Crawford was a broke, useless man. In the space of 3 pages, I had taken that foundation and turned it to dust. His multi-thousand-dollar legal strategy had just been rendered completely worthless. He wasn't a lawyer anymore. He was a man in a very expensive suit trying to contain a Category 5 hurricane. They were out there for 15 minutes. 15 minutes of what I can only imagine was the most panicked, desperate legal conference of Fleming's life. When they finally returned, they were 2 completely different people from the pair who had strode in with such confidence. The arrogance was gone. The smugness had evaporated. All that was left was a pale, exhausted desperation. They sat down heavily, avoiding eye contact with me. Fleming cleared his throat, shuffling the papers in my blue folder, which he had carried back in with him like a sacred, terrifying object. He was trying to reassemble some semblance of authority, but his voice was strained. "Well, Mark," he began, attempting a congenial tone that was utterly unconvincing. "It appears you've been busy." He forced a weak smile. "Clearly, we need to reevaluate the marital assets. Under Texas law, any business conceived and created during the marriage is considered community property. As such, my client is entitled to 50% of the value of Phoenix Digital Holdings." He said it with a kind of desperate bravado, the last-ditch argument of a man who knew he was cornered. He was trying to claw back $5 million from the wreckage of his own failed strategy. He looked at me, expecting a fight, an argument. He was expecting the beginning of a long, ugly negotiation. But I said nothing. I didn't have to. I just turned my head slightly and looked at Jessica. She had been perfectly silent, and still this whole time, a coiled spring of predatory patience. Her expression was completely neutral, but I saw a flicker of something in her eyes. It was a faint, almost imperceptible glint of triumph. He had just walked his client directly into the second half of the trap, and now it was Jessica's turn. Arthur Fleming's desperate plea for 50% of Phoenix Digital hung in the air. He looked from me to Jessica, a hopeful, desperate glint in his eyes, expecting the long, drawn-out battle of negotiations to begin. He was about to be sorely disappointed. Jessica, who had been a statue of coiled patience, finally moved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't display any anger. She simply gave a small, almost pitying nod, as if to thank him for so perfectly setting the stage for her. She opened her own pristine file folder, the contents of which I knew by heart. "The argument of community property is an interesting one, Arthur," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision. "But for it to apply, there would have to be, in fact, community property." She slid a single, crisp document across the mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of him. "This is a certified statement from my client's Vanguard brokerage account, established in 1998, 6 years before his marriage to your client. As you can see, it is and has always been his sole and separate property." Before he could fully process it, she followed it with a second document, placing it right beside the first. "And this is the initial funding statement for Phoenix Digital Holdings, showing a direct wire transfer of $250,000 from that same premarital account. The new company was not funded with marital assets. Fleming's face tightened. He was a good lawyer. He knew what that meant. He was losing his footing. The funding may be separate, he stammered. But the labor, the sweat equities Mr. Crawford put in during the marriage. I'm glad you brought that up, Jessica said, cutting him off smoothly. She slid a third document in front of him. It was a simple timeline. On one side was a date highlighted in yellow, July 10th, 2025, the date his own office had filed the divorce petition on Linda's behalf. On the other side was a date highlighted in green, July 12th, 2025, the date Phoenix Digital was officially incorporated. The record is quite clear, Jessica continued, her voice still unnervingly calm. Your client filed to dissolve this marital partnership on July 10th. My client began the work, the sweat equity as you call it, on a new venture 2 days later. It is a bold legal strategy, Arthur, to claim a share in a partnership that your client had already legally declared her intent to abandon. Fleming was speechless. His entire argument had been dismantled in less than a minute. He just stared at the papers, his mind racing for a counter-argument that didn't exist. But really, Jessica said, leaning forward slightly, all of these legal arguments are secondary to the matter of intent, aren't they? She reached into her bag and placed a small, discreet audio speaker on the center of the table. My client's wife, your client, has been very clear about her intentions throughout this process. She pressed a button. A moment of static, and then Linda's voice, cheerful, giddy, and utterly damning, filled the silent boardroom. It's pathetic. He's completely broken, Carol. He just sits in the guest room all day staring at spreadsheets. I'll be free of this useless man in a few weeks, and I'll get everything. The house, the accounts, everything. The sound cut off, leaving behind a silence that was more profound than any noise could ever be. I looked at Linda. Her face was a mask of pure, soul-crushing humiliation. A deep crimson blush crept up her neck, staining her skin. Her eyes were wide with horror, darting between me, Jessica, and her own lawyer, who was now staring at her with an expression of utter betrayal. She had not only lost the case, she had lost her dignity in front of the one man she was paying to protect it. Jessica let the silence sit for a moment longer before sliding one final single sheet of paper across the table. This is our final non-negotiable offer, she stated. I watched Fleming pick it up with a trembling hand and read it. I knew the terms by heart. Linda would receive 0 equity, 0 profits, and have 0 association with Phoenix Digital. The house on Lake Travis would be sold, and the proceeds split exactly 50-50. However, her share would have $60,000 deducted from it first, to reimburse the joint account for her spending spree after our separation. And finally, the last line, the petitioner may keep her vehicle and any personal effects, including her collection of handbags. It was a total, unconditional surrender. Fleming read it, and then he read it again. He looked at the mountain of evidence against him. He looked at his own humiliated, defeated client. He let out a long, slow sigh, the sound of a man who knew he was beaten. He took a pen from his expensive suit jacket and pushed it, along with the settlement agreement, in front of Linda. Her hand was shaking as she took the pen. She didn't read the document. For just a fraction of a second, her eyes flicked up and met mine. In them I didn't see the hatred or the cold contempt from months ago. I saw a flash of something else, a deep, hollow echo of the 25 years we had shared. It was a fleeting glimpse of the woman she might have been, a silent acknowledgement of the future she had just gambled away for a life of luxury that would never be hers. The moment passed as quickly as it came. Her gaze dropped back to the paper. Her expression hardened again into a mask of bitter resolve, and she signed her name. Jessica and I stood up in unison. We didn't offer condolences. We didn't say thank you. We gathered our papers, turned, and walked out of the conference room, leaving Linda and her lawyer sitting in the ruins of their own greed. The scales of justice had finally been balanced. A week after the meeting, I was standing on the balcony of a minimalist apartment on the 40th floor of a downtown Austin high-rise. The sprawling house on Lake Travis, with its ghosts and its heavy, curated perfection, was gone. The sale had closed 2 days ago, a quick, clean transaction, and my half of the proceeds, minus Linda's $60,000 reimbursement, was now sitting in my new personal bank account. Below me, the city lights spread out like a galaxy of fallen stars, a river of headlights flowing down Congress Avenue. The air was cool and clean, and for the first time in a very long time I could breathe. I had spent the last few nights here surrounded by little more than a bed, a desk, and this incredible view. The emptiness didn't feel lonely. It felt clean. It felt like a blank page. I thought about the scene in the boardroom, the memory of Linda's devastated face as she signed the papers. A week ago, that image might have brought me a sense of vengeful satisfaction, but now it just felt distant. The anger, the profound sense of betrayal that had fueled me for 3 months, had burned itself out, leaving behind not a scar but a strange, quiet peace. The sting was gone. Looking out at the endless stream of lights, I finally understood the truth of what had happened to me. The failure of Innovate Solutions, the event I had seen as the absolute end of my world, wasn't an ending at all. It was a filter. It was a brutal, painful, but ultimately necessary forest fire that had burned everything down to the bedrock. It had burned away my pride, my complacency, and my naive belief in a partnership that had been hollow for years. It had filtered out the one person in my life who was never truly on my team, revealing a truth that I had been too comfortable or too blind to see on my own. It was a costly education, but the clarity it provided was priceless. My phone buzzed on the small table beside me, pulling me from my thoughts. I picked it up. It was a text from David. I read the short message under the glow of the city lights. Phase 2 funding just cleared. Board approved the new valuation. We're officially a unicorn, Mark. A unicorn. I read the text again, and a feeling I hadn't experienced in months washed over me. It wasn't the cold satisfaction of revenge or the grim validation of winning. It was pure, unadulterated joy. A genuine, wide smile spread across my face, not of a man who had gotten even, but of a man who was excited about what came next. The $10 million valuation in the boardroom had been my weapon. This new valuation, the one that made us a $1 billion unicorn, was my future. I looked back out at the skyline, at the endless possibilities stretching out to the horizon. I wasn't the man who had lost his past anymore. I was the man who had just bought back his future. Linda hadn't destroyed me. She had, in her own cruel and transactional way, liberated me. She didn't leave me when I had nothing. She left me when she thought I had nothing. And in the end, that's exactly what I left her with.